Good morning, guys, and welcome to today's webinar. We have Paul Moore with The Boring Investor. And a quick, brief intro. Paul is the founder and CEO of Wellings Capital, and it's a real estate private equity firm established in 2015. It seeks to help high income earners, high net worth individuals, doctors, lawyers, dentists, and grow their wealth through private commercial real estate investing. He's got over 900 plus investors across different investment vehicles, multifamily, private real estate, and he's got a current portfolio at approximately 350 million with approximately 180 million of investor equity under management as of January 2025. And he's going to talk to us all about the boring investor, building a hands-off portfolio to grow your wealth and decrease your stress. So, Paul, welcome.
Hey, it's great to be here again, Dr. Lou. How are you?
Good. I've introduced you and take it away.
Okay, fantastic. I'm really excited to be here again. Thank you for the opportunity. If you're a speed reader, you should definitely read this disclaimer. Like you said, I've written a couple books on commercial real estate investing. I've been a blogger for Fox Business, the Real Estate Guys. I've written for the Alternative Investment Almanac. Our company has raised, like you said, about 180, 190 million in equity for commercial real estate across various funds. I wrote a book on residential real estate. Then I wrote a book on commercial real estate, what was humbly titled The Perfect Investment, about multifamily. And I also wrote a book on self-storage. Before we met, Chris, I actually also had a podcast for 4 years I co-hosted called How to Lose Money. Now, it was actually a wealth building podcast, but we talked about people's failures, pain, and losses on the way to the top. Chris, my problem over the years was I was not this guy. I was not a boring investor. In every job, every investment I ever did, I was always the type A, driven, let's get it done guy. And that's what got me in trouble. I actually thought that I should get the same excitement and thrill out of investing that I had out of being an entrepreneur. I was an entrepreneur for about 5 or 6 years. We sold our company to a public firm in 1997. And by 1998, I was a full-time investor. So I thought. I really was more of a speculator than an investor. And I didn't know the difference, even though I had an MBA. Go figure. And anyway, like I said, I thought I should get the same excitement, the same fun out of investing that I did out of being an entrepreneur. I was an entrepreneurial investor. I made that up. Entrepreneurial investors love the thrill of the chase. They stay in startup mode for years. They get a rush out of the process. They repeat the learning curve over and over. We get a broad knowledge, but not a deep knowledge of any one subject. We might hit a grand slam, or it's more likely, as I did, that we'll strike out. Like I said, I was a full-time speculator, and I was on the road to living in a mansion or working at Walmart after retiring. That's the problem with entrepreneurial investing. You might hit it out of the park, but it's more likely that you won't. Today, I'm going to argue for the opposite strategy. I'm going to argue that the most profitable path to wealth is becoming a boring investor. So let's talk about that. Boring investors attain true wealth. Now, I didn't even know what true wealth was. Years ago, I thought it was something about living in a mansion or having a fancy car or boat. What I found out was that true wealth is having assets that produce income. A lot of you read Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's about being in that quadrant where your money produces money. And being specifically in the real estate business, in the commercial real estate business, I love private real estate because we're not dependent on a CEO scandal or a random tweet from Elon or a war in the Middle East or the mood on Wall Street. Boring investors, they put their money in things that often don't look very exciting, and they sit there for a long time, but they build wealth slowly. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Paul Samuelson was the first U.S. economist to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said, investing should be boring. It should be like watching paint dry or watching grass grow. He said, if you want excitement, take $800 and go to Las Vegas. Boring investors attain true wealth, and they also enjoy real freedom. I used to joke around, Chris, that as an entrepreneur, I've got true freedom. I've got the freedom to work any 80 hours a week I choose. That's not freedom. That's not even funny. My kids will tell you it's not funny because I did that for years, but it's bondage. And we were put on the earth for so much more than that. We were put on the earth not to have the bondage of trading hours for dollars for our whole life. It's one thing to do it for a while, but it's another thing to do it into your 80s. We're put on the earth to have freedom from worrying about the price of your crypto account or your next GameStop deal, or freedom from toilets, tenants, and trash if you're a real estate investor, freedom to use your time and money to make a difference in the world, and freedom from agonizing over every financial decision. Boring investors enjoy true freedom, and they also avoid hidden costs. I've got a good friend named Kevin. Kevin invests with my company, Wellings Capital. And Kevin used to be chained to his stock ticker. He was constantly looking at the options he had with a tech company that had gone public. And it started to cut into his family time. It started to cut into his sleep. It started to cut into his productivity. He lost countless hours, and also just countless, he doesn't even know how much it cost him in his health, in his relationships, and he didn't make a dime more because trading actively, he probably lost money. Kevin has now traded in all that excitement for the boring life of sailing in the Puget Sound, investing passively in commercial real estate and in ETFs. He's avoided the hidden costs that come with entrepreneurial investing. Boring investors lose money and make a fortune. I mentioned that I had a podcast called How to Lose Money. And what we found on that podcast is a lot of people who made the biggest mistakes learned from those mistakes, and they went on to leverage. A lot of those mistakes came around 2008 for some reason. I think you guys remember what I'm talking about. But they used those mistakes to make better decisions in the future. Now, what amazed me as I studied these boring investors who lost money along the way, and that's pretty much everybody, by the way, the ones who really leveraged those mistakes to go on to make money were some of the most successful people I ever spoke to. I never spoke to him, but Charlie Munger was considered by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett to be the smartest investor in the world. They said he had the most genius mind for investing. And so you'd think, what does the most genius investor in the world do? He's probably creating some kind of complex algorithms that nobody could understand. He's probably taking Einstein's theories and applying them to investing. And that's exactly the opposite of what Charlie Munger did. Charlie Munger said his goal was to avoid repeatable mistakes. That may sound cool, but think deeply about that. If you're the smartest investor in the world, wouldn't you want to be doing something more than just avoiding other people's mistakes? But yet Munger and Buffett say that is the path to wealth. They said they didn't want to have to jump over 8-foot hurdles. They wanted to step over simple 1-foot hurdles and avoid other people's mistakes. And it's pretty amazing to think about that. But when you do think about it, you also realize it's really important to avoid single mistakes that could take you down. Like the time I bet everything in my Roth IRA on this oil and gas deal that was a sure thing in North Dakota. You can guess where that money went. It's gone. It's down in a hole in the ground somewhere in North Dakota. And it's really, of course, that was like, 15, 20 years ago. But it's really important that you make mistakes. When you make mistakes, they're non-fatal, which is an argument for diversification. We'll talk more about that later. Boring investors realize they might be wrong. Boring investors realize that our minds neuroplasticity says that our minds can and should change. Chris Davis from Davis Advisors is one of the great investors in America, and he's got a wall of shame in his office. The wall of shame shows their biggest mistakes, like when they invested in AIG. It'll have the stock certificate, and then below that, bullet points of all the mistaken thinking that went in to buying and holding that investment. And they look at that wall of shame when they make new investments and they say, are we doing any of these things? They do what's called a pre-mortem. In other words, they go forward 10 years in time. And Chris says they look at they assume everything went wrong with the investment they're making today. Then they say, okay, what went wrong? And then they just make up stories about what went wrong, and it helps them dig in deeper onto the current investment to make better decisions. Charlie Munger, again, he insisted on rubbing his own nose in their mistakes. He stood in a room of 40,000 Berkshire Hathaway devotees, him and Warren Buffett, and Charlie said, we were horses' asses. We failed you. And he didn't mind saying that. Think about most CEOs of public companies. They're not going to say that, but they wanted to constantly look and rub their own noses in their own mistakes and others to make sure they didn't do it again. Boring investors invest in boring assets. I can't think of anything more boring than 4 pieces of sheet metal, some rivets, a floor, and a door. But that's exactly what we invest in. That's self-storage. Mobile home parks, they're worse than boring. Over decades, nobody even considered them an asset class. Nobody would even review them when they were looking at commercial real estate. But Sam Zell quietly acquired 158,000 mobile home park pads from the 60s until his recent passing. And Sam Zell became the most successful real estate investor in American history, arguably. His boring assets have made him billions. And it might be more exciting to invest in some crypto trading scheme or something. And I'm not against crypto at all. That's not my point. My point is boring assets often result in creating true wealth. Speaking of boring investors, invest in the gold rush. Now, my wife and I went on an Alaskan cruise about 10 months ago, and we stood in the exact location where about 100 to 120,000 gold miners they left the civilization and they went off into the Yukon wilderness to try to find gold. Not surprisingly, only a small percentage, I believe about 30,000 made it. The rest turned back or died along the way. And of that 30,000 that made it, only about 3,000 actually found any gold. So why would I recommend investing in a gold rush? I'm talking about the guys who sold them the picks and shovels. And I'm guessing you figured out where I was going there. The guys who sold them the picks and shovels, who sold them the lodging and the dog sleds and all that kind of stuff, they made a fortune doing this. And they actually vacationed on some of the same mountains like we did 100 years later, the same mountains where these miners bled and died. Boring investors sell picks and shovels. Boring investors also diversify. Now, you can tell I like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, but Buffett made a comment. He said, diversification is for people who don't really know what they're doing. And that deeply offended me because I thought, wait a minute, diversification, everybody knows that's a smart strategy. But then I looked at Buffett's own portfolio. He, last I checked, was a Fortune 7 company, Berkshire Hathaway, and they are the most diversified company on the Fortune 10 or the Fortune 500, as far as I know. He's got about 108 different companies in different businesses with different management teams, and that's how he's made a fortune for him and his investors. What he's talking about is diversification within your specialty. So if you're a doctor, imagine that you diversified and just said, okay, I want to be a neurologist. I want to be a neurosurgeon. I want to be a podiatrist, a family doctor. I think I'll be a dentist as well. Obviously, you wouldn't be great at any of those. Excuse me. But if you're a hospital system, you might need all of those. You might need those and 100 more positions filled, and you want someone who's laser focused in each one. And that's exactly what Buffett does. He has teams that are laser focused on, like I said, about 108 different businesses. And that's the kind of diversification I think as investors we should go for. Now, I'm about to offend somebody. Okay, Chris. If you're a dentist, a doctor, IT professional, and you watch HGTV and you decide you want to maybe flip some houses on the side or get some real estate on the side, I'm guessing you'll find, like most of our investors who have done this, that they find themselves, one of my doctor friends got called on Christmas Eve during a candlelight service to go out and fix a plumbing leak that was pretty serious at one of his tenants' homes. And he realized, why am I doing this? I make so much money staying in my lane. I should just outsource this. And he has invested with us since. And so my advice, and the advice I take myself, is to not do the things we could do because they're not always that profitable. My company, Wellings Capital, invests in all kinds of different assets like self-storage, mobile home parks, that's manufactured home communities, RV parks, light industrial, multifamily, open air shopping centers, single family rentals. By putting together a portfolio of people who are laser focused in each one of these disciplines, we're able to get returns from all of them. And I think as an investor, that is a great way to think. That's, if you're in the stock market, that might be investing in a mutual fund that's really good at picking managers and companies to invest in. Boring investors don't chase shiny objects. Like I said, when I sold my company in 1997, I thought, I'm a full-time investor now. And I thought I was pretty cool. I thought, full-time investor, that'd be cool on my business card. Little did I know that I was a full-time speculator, and I should have been put on my business card a certified shiny object chaser, because that's what I did. And it was a really bad plan. I think I've made that clear already. Investor extraordinaire George Soros says, if investing is entertaining, if you're having fun, you're probably not making any money. Good investing should be boring. Boring investors don't chase shiny objects, and they're also simpletons. Now, Warren Buffett, we'll talk more about this later, was greatly criticized, actually throughout his career. For one thing, he was criticized for not investing in tech stocks in 1998, 1999, when other people were making thousands of percentage returns. He stood up a bunch of billionaires in Sun Valley, Idaho. I believe it was 1999. And he said, I would rather invest in Wrigley's gum than in your tech stocks, because I know exactly how people will be chewing gum in 10 years. I don't know where the internet will be in 10 years. And of course, we all know that 2 years later, Wrigley's gum had drastically outperformed the tech stocks that these folks had invested in when the tech bubble burst. And so it's really easy to get attracted to something that's exciting or new or different. It could be a new coin offering if you're into crypto. It could be, there's all kinds of things we could invest in. Warren Buffett doesn't even use Excel. He invests in stuff he can calculate in his head or with a simple calculator. These complex mathematical models look really cool, but they don't necessarily always bring us better results. Like I said, Buffett and Munger say their goal is to step over 1 foot hurdles rather than jump over 8 foot hurdles, because boring investors are simpletons. Boring investors traded FOMO for FOMO, and they got JOMO. Silly, I know. FOMO, of course, is fear of missing out. I used to have the fear of missing out. I didn't want to say no to anything. My default was to say yes to almost every investment opportunity because they all look good on paper, don't they? Last year, our company looked at, I think, 745 investment opportunities. We said no to all but 5. All 745 looked really good. But we took Buffett's advice. Warren Buffett said, over the years, a number of very smart people have learned the hard way that a long string of impressive numbers multiplied by a single zero always equals zero. So we traded FOMO for FOMO, which is the fear of messing up. And when you experience FOMO enough, the fear of messing up, you eventually get JOMO, and that's the joy of missing out. My company has missed out of those 740 deals we passed on last year. Some of those are going to do really well, and I'll hear about it someday. Some of those people will come back and say, hey, I sold this for a 300% profit. And we'll say, oh, that hurt a little bit. But you know what? We look back at the due diligence we did on the front end, and we saw stuff in the due diligence that just made us unsure. And so we actually get a joy out of following our process and knowing that if we do that consistently year in and year out, that we will actually likely, there's no guarantee, will likely win in the end. If we follow Buffett and Munger, we certainly will. Here's an amazing statistic that I hesitate to share on here. Take some notes on this if you want to, and go look it up yourself. There was a Forbes article that said this. If you take Berkshire Hathaway's stock price and cut it by 99%, that means if it's $100 a share, for example, you cut it down to $1 a share, it still will wallop the S&P 500 over the last 59 or 60 years. Now, that's hard to believe, but if you think about it, and by the way, it is true. If you think about it, it just tells you the power of thinking like a boring investor. If you all have studied the life of Charlie Munger or Warren Buffett, you would hardly believe how boring their lives are. Most of us couldn't do Buffett's job for 1 week, far less for 62 or whatever straight years that he has sat in his office, stared at for 8 hours a day, typically, at just statistics and P&Ls and balance sheets. He just stares at these things. And then he can make very quick decisions, even on a 20-minute phone call, to invest $1 billion to buy ABC back when he did, and made a small fortune for his investors because he knows those numbers so well. Boring investors trade FOMO for FOMO, and they get the joy of missing out. Boring investors imitate patterns, not outliers. Now, speculators love to look at outliers and imitate those. Hey, I heard about this guy on the internet who, and if you're a doctor, there's that saying that my doctor has on his coffee cup. It says, don't mistake your internet search for my medical degree. Speculators look for those outliers and they try to imitate those. Think about Jesse Livermore. Now, you probably don't know who that is, but if you were around 95 years ago, you would have known that name, because Jesse Livermore shorted the stock market in October of 1929. You may remember that date when the stock market crashed. By shorting it, he made about $100 million. And that's, I believe, about $4 billion today. Jesse Livermore was considered an investing hero, someone to copy, someone to emulate, someone to write books about. But Jesse Livermore couldn't replicate his own outlying success, and he tragically took his own life about 11 years later. It may be exciting to day trade. It may be exciting to imitate Jesse Livermore. It may be really boring to imitate Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and invest in commercial real estate. But honestly, it's probably usually a more consistent path to long-term wealth. Charlie Munger was talking about the stock market. They don't talk much about real estate, but I love this quote. He said, most people probably shouldn't do anything other than have index funds. It's a perfectly rational thing to do for somebody who just doesn't want to think much about it and has no reason to believe he has any advantage as a stock picker. And I would add, somebody who's got a full-time career already making good money in what they're doing. Munger goes on and says, why should anyone try to pick their own stocks? They don't design their own electric motors or build their own egg beaters, do they? I love that quote. And that's right before Charlie Munger passed away about a year and a half ago. We like to imitate outliers because they're exciting, but it's smarter to imitate patterns of people who done really well. And in a related way, boring investors play games. They're equipped to win. I usually pronounce his name wrong, but speaking of outliers, think about Muggsy Bogues. He was a 5'3" NBA basketball star. Now, would it be smart to imitate him as the ultimate outlier in the NBA? Probably not. My friend, Bruce, actually tried to imitate Babe Ruth. He said one year he had gone from the single A to the double A to the triple A farm club of the Boston Red Sox about 30 years ago. And he said, hey, I'm going to try to imitate Babe Ruth. I'm going to try to get all the home runs I can this year. So he practiced all year preparing to hit as many home runs as he could. And he hit the most home runs he ever did. But he also, as you can guess, struck out more than ever before and had the lowest batting average ever. And it was part of the reason, one of several, that he did not make it to the Boston Red Sox majors. Tiger Woods is another example. Tiger was playing in his first British Open decades ago, and it was notorious for bunkers, for sand traps. And the reporters asked him, why aren't you practicing your sand traps, your bunker game this week here as we practice for the British Open? He said, I'm not going to do that. I'm working on my drives and my middle irons so I can avoid the sand traps. And he played the whole British Open without landing in a single bunker. He played to his strengths and he ignored his weaknesses. And again, I think that's what we can do. If you've got a career, if you've got a family, if you've got hobbies, if you're enjoying your retirement, does it really make sense to jump in and try to pick individual stocks or invest individually in real estate? It might, but it's more likely that it should be handed off to somebody who's focused on that. Boring investors understand what they can control and what they can't. We can't control a pandemic. We can't control interest rates. We can't control the economy or who gets elected president or who gets to Congress, but we can control our diversification, who we invest with, how much debt they take on. We can decide if we want to invest in somebody who uses risky floating rate debt or not, for example. And again, entrepreneurial investors, they try to make bets on things they can't control. It's like rolling the dice. The more you play double or nothing, you'll eventually land on nothing. And then what will you have left to invest? You'll have to start over from scratch. And it's very expensive to do that. Boring investors, though, understand what they can control. They know that they don't have a crystal ball. Peter Lynch, the extraordinary investor with Fidelity, said those who live by a crystal ball are destined to eat glass. And there's always exceptions. There's people like even Warren Buffett himself, but also Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or the Facebook and Google founders. They were very successful, but they also had a good bit of luck and providence. If you study their stories, you probably couldn't go in and compete with some of them today. Imagine you tried to start your own Google to compete with Google or Facebook today or Amazon. It would be a terrible idea. They had providence, they had luck, they had timing, they had the right connections. It's likely that most of us won't have those things, that those were outliers. And it's also likely that the crystal ball that you think that you and I could look into to make these decisions is probably pretty hazy today. Boring investors don't try to invest through a crystal ball. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger said, and it's hard to believe this, but I believe it. They said in 60 years of investing together, they never made a single investment or divestment decision based on the economy. They always looked at the fundamentals of the asset class and tried to get intrinsic value in the investments they made. That's value that is packed in there that other investors didn't recognize. And like I said, they've done pretty well for themselves. Boring investors are extremely patient. I already mentioned Paul Samuelson's quote about watching paint dry or watching grass grow, which is the opposite of day trading. Charlie Munger said the big money is made not in buying or selling, but in the waiting. Warren Buffett said the stock market is a device that transfers money from the impatient to the patient. Buffett's been criticized a lot for sitting on over $300 billion in cash right now. Some of his own investors are really mad that they're getting 5% or whatever, 4.5% T-bill rates on that right now. I'm guessing 5 or 10 years from now, we'll see that was a really wise decision. Jeff Bezos studied Warren Buffett, and he said to Warren, he said, "Hey, wait a minute, Warren, your investing strategy is not that complicated. Why doesn't everybody just imitate you?" Buffett said, "No, nobody wants to get rich that slowly." Think about that. No one wants to get rich that slowly, yet he's outperformed the S&P 500 by over 100x. Boring investors are willing to be patient and wait for the right opportunities. This is the crazy one. Boring investors eat sardines. Years ago, there was a bubble in the sardine market. This is a parable. Speculators poured in, buying and selling barrels of sardines, driving the price ever upwards. One day, a speculator who forgot his lunch decided to open a barrel of sardines and eat some. They were disgusting, and he loudly complained about this to his friends. A particularly grizzled old trader responded, "Of course they're gross. Those aren't for eating. They're trading sardines." Now think about that. If you're into multifamily investing already, if you're into real estate, the unrenovated 1970s and 80s buildings of all those real estate syndicators that they bought and they slapped lipstick on and resold a year and a half later, hoping someone else would pay them millions more. It really worked until it didn't. The rising tide lifted all boats in the last decade in commercial real estate. It ended abruptly in 2022, as we predicted it would. But that rising tide, Buffett said, will eventually go out, and then we'll see who's skinny dipping. And that's exactly what happened. And commercial real estate happened in the form of all those people I mentioned, those people who were trading sardines, who were trading these multifamily assets. They were all using easy money, floating rate debt with no early payoff penalty so they could sell them. And then they got over a dozen, I believe it was actually 11 real estate interest rate increases in 16 months. And those 11 increases caused many to crash and burn. I saw today that in 2025, there's $384 billion of extend and pretend loans out there, Chris, that are going to come due this year. This is where people were just kicking the can down the road. The lender was giving them grace, and they're finally going to come due. And we don't know what will happen yet. It's possible the lowering interest rates will save them. It's possible capital calls will save them, but it's also possible that billions and billions of dollars more will be lost. There's already been a lot lost since 2022 when the interest rates started going up. Boring investors eat sardines. Boring investors say no a lot. Warren Buffett said, the best investors say no a lot. The very best investors say no almost all the time. Like I said before, I was obsessed with saying yes when I had a few $1 million back in 1997, and I found myself in deep trouble within the next 3 or 4 years. And I learned a lot of lessons that we do the opposite of now. In fact, my company, Wellings Capital, like I said, looked at 745 deals last year and passed on all but 5, which is under 1%. I mentioned this before, but like I said, and please take this to heart, all of them look good up front. All of them look like great deals. All of them look exciting, like something you might want to invest in. But once you dig deeper and deeper, you realize most deals are not necessarily safe. Remember, we're not looking just for returns or projected returns. We're looking for risk-adjusted returns. We're looking for the best risk-adjusted returns. And sometimes those aren't 20% a year. Sometimes they're a lower number, but they provide lower risk and it's worth it. Boring investors choose a lane and stay in it. One of my business partners ran for governor of Colorado in 2017 or 18. And he told me he was rubbing shoulders with billionaires during this process. And he said, hey, they're not really that much smarter. They don't have, on average, better education than us. A lot of them dropped out of college. He said what they did really is they chose a lane at a young age and they stayed in it. They stayed in their lane. They stayed hyper-focused. And like Gary Keller of Keller Williams said, they say no to 1,000 distractions so they can say yes to their one thing. And that's in his great book, The One Thing by Jay Papasan and Gary Keller. Michael Phelps, think about this. If he would have set out as a kid to win 28 Olympic medals, he probably wouldn't have imagined he could do that. He probably might have thought, hey, I better learn to do the high jump really well and the long jump and the 200 and the 400 meter. And I better learn to dive. I better play water polo. Oh, and I better swim and do lots of events in swimming. If he would have done that, you know what would have happened. We never, ever would have heard of him. Instead, he's won 28 medals. I think 23 of those were gold medals, the greatest in human history. He did that because he stayed very focused and he had a daily routine, not 5 or 6, but 7 days a week routine that was extremely boring. Buffett calls it your circle of competence. He says it's not important how big or small your circle of competence is. What's important is that you stay in the circle and that you know its edges. Charlie Munger's friend, John Arrieta, knew his edges. He actually made a goal to buy all the real estate he could within a mile or two of Stanford's campus. He eventually went outside of that a little bit. But John Arrieta, you might think that sounds like a dumb idea, but he actually became a billionaire using this strategy. Now, John Arrieta's specialty is not real estate. It's not real estate in North America or real estate in California or Northern California or even the San Francisco area. It's real estate within a mile or two of Stanford's campus. He's done quite well with that. Again, he chose a lane and he's staying in it. So I'd ask you, if you are a busy medical professional or IT professional, attorney, dentist, wealthy person, accredited investor, do you really want to spend the time to become an expert? Do you really want to get to a place where you could do this, where you could look at 745 deals in a year and know which 5 to choose? By the way, there's no proof we chose the right 5, but we have these very disciplined process we went into. We chose a lane in commercial real estate and we stay in that lane. Boring investors don't get the buzz of grinding harder. I used to daydream about cloning myself. I thought, what if God would give me like 10 more hours every day? I love that. I thought I would, but you know what? I don't think it would be better, because what I would do is I'd get serious about playing bass again. I'd join another band. I'd read more novels. I'd travel. I'd watch all 8 seasons of 24. I'd pick up swing dancing, join an extra group at my church, volunteer to feed homeless people on Saturdays, learn a new board game and a new card game. I'd write an extra book, start a daily podcast, read more biographies, spend more time with my 4 kids and my wife, my friends. And at the end of the day, I'd have more plates spinning and be even more stressed out than I spent most of the last 30 or 40 years of my life. I would have got a buzz out of grinding harder, though. And I would say that boring investors don't get this buzz. They actually have lower blood pressure. They live longer, happier lives. They have happier families on average, and they can create a fortune in the process. Boring investors don't get the buzz out of grinding harder. Here's a really important one. Boring investors suffer mockery and misunderstanding. I already mentioned Warren Buffett in 1999 and repeatedly for decades. Remember, he said he'd rather invest in chewing gum than in tech because he knew how people would be chewing gum in 10 years. He didn't know where tech would be. Buffett has invested in tech since, but he's invested in Apple, and he considered a completely different category than he did tech. And you can read more about that if you look it up online. But he has suffered massive mockery and misunderstanding. He was 69 years old, I believe, in 1999. They called him over the hill. They called him foolish, a foolish old man. Now he's 94 and he's out invested almost everybody that made fun of him. But he was willing to stay the course, stay in his lane. He was willing to stay focused. He lives in the same house he lived in. I think he bought it in the mid 1950s. He still lives in that same house in Omaha because boring investors are willing to suffer that mockery and misunderstanding. And often, you might have heard about this, they live next door. I was in West Palm Beach once doing an investor breakfast at Panera. And one guy there who was a little older than the average in the group, he wouldn't tell what he did. He said, "Oh, I just go to my kids' soccer games and PTA meetings and I flip a few houses." I knew there was more to the story. I kept digging. Finally, I found out that this guy was the retired president of Office Depot, CEO of Ulta, and CEO of Michaels. And he said he was tired of missing his kids' sports and soccer games and PTA meetings. He actually drove away that day in a very basic Ford Explorer. Now, another 29-year-old at that same meeting drove away in a new Tesla. And I thought that was pretty cool. I never would have imagined this guy was as successful and wealthy as he was because boring investors don't have to flaunt it. They often live next door. You might have heard that book, The Millionaire Next Door. It is true. Boring investors invest in relationships. I really admire a lot of the great investors we've been talking about today. Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger. We didn't talk about much about him, but Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, but they all have had very difficult relational experiences. They've either had divorces or multiple wives, multiple children. And a lot of them, I think at the end of their life, like Lee Iacocca said, nobody on their deathbed wishes they had spent more time at the office. Boring investors invest in relationships. Hey, I can't judge these guys. Like I said, for years, I worked long hours. I was busy. I was glued to my BlackBerry, not my iPhone. That was years ago. You get it. But I can't judge them because I made a lot of the same mistakes. And I'm here today to tell you it's not worth it. And investing in relationships may seem boring, but it's a lot better way to live. And it will provide you a lot better end to your life. Boring investors invest in silence, solitude, and Sabbath. Chris, I used to love weekends. I love Saturdays. I love Sundays because I got less emails and I got less phone calls so I could get more work done. I used to think that way, but then I read Hal Elrod's Miracle Morning and a lot of other resources. And one book I'd highly recommend you write down and get is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. It's a great book. Talks about eliminating hurry from your life, slowing down, investing in silence and solitude and Sabbath. I do all those now and I'm much happier. My blood pressure is lower. My family loves me more, I think. And I never would have thought those were good things. Another thing I've been investing heavily in is I invest heavily in sleep now. I was in bed, it may sound boring, 9 hours last night and got 7.5 hours real sleep. And I measure that on my Oura ring. That's a boring thing to do, but I wasn't up at midnight working like I used to. Boring investors invest in these boring types of rituals. Boring investors invest in happiness. You can look this up yourself. There are multiple studies talking about happiness satiation. meaning you're not going to get any happier once you reach and surpass a certain income level. The last studies I've seen say typically like $95,000. With inflation, let's say $150,000. If you're making $150,000, these studies say you won't be any happier if you make 1.5 million or 15 million or 150 million a year. You might be less happy, in fact. So if that's true, does it really make sense if you're already making good money to go out and flip houses on the side, or go out and day trade on the side, or go out and try to figure out some way to eke out an extra 2 or 3% in your portfolio by doing it yourself? It probably doesn't. Boring investors invest in happiness, and they also invest in the unseen realm where there's apparently no return on investment. Now, how many of you have heard of George Washington? Okay, silly question, I know. How many of you have heard of William Wilberforce? Okay, that's a more important question. I would postulate that William Wilberforce should be far more famous than George Washington, or as famous in world history. He lived at the same time across the pond in England, and he made it his goal, his ambition, to set the slaves of the Western Hemisphere free, and he actually did it. He actually got slavery outlawed, the slave trade outlawed, after something like 20 years of fighting for this in Parliament in England. He actually, 3 days before he died, they completely outlawed slavery in the United Kingdom. And of course, that spilled over to the United States and other places in the Western Hemisphere. William Wilberforce staked his wealth, his reputation, his friendships, his health. I know that conflicts with the last slide, but he staked all that just to do something where there was apparently no reward for him, and just a ton of criticism as a wealthy white guy in England. He invested in the unseen realm. William Wilberforce invested for a testimony, not a title. The King of England had a title. William Wilberforce, who's just a Parliament guy, has a testimony that will live on for thousands of years. Pharaoh had a title. Moses had a testimony. Pilate had a title. Jesus had a testimony. J. Edgar Hoover had a title. Martin Luther King Jr. has a testimony. And a lot of boring investors don't invest to make a name for themselves, but they invest to make the world a better place. And they invest to leave a legacy like William Wilberforce has. Whether you've heard of him or not, go check out the movie Amazing Grace that was made in 2007 about the life of William Wilberforce, or read the wonderful novel by Eric Metaxas about the life of Wilberforce. Boring investors invest to truly leave a legacy. Wellings Capital was trying to figure out, hey, we're pretty successful now. What should we do to leave a legacy? And you know, it pains me to tell you this, and I hate to end this on a downer, but even though Wilberforce freed the slaves in England, there are more slaves around the world now than ever before. There's about 50 million slaves estimated worldwide right now. Since we started this webinar, hundreds and hundreds of children have been sold or captured into slavery, possibly over 1,000. If you added up the record net income of ExxonMobil, Nike, and Walmart, record profits, added it up, tripled that number, that's about the annual profits from human trafficking worldwide every year. Wellings Capital, we didn't think this was acceptable, but we knew we couldn't solve the problem, but we picked, just like we do in commercial real estate, we handpicked one partner to invest heavily with. It's called AIM, AIM. You can go to their website, aimfree.org. We have influenced, donated, and raised, now it's actually over $800,000 since 2021, to fight human trafficking and rescue its victims. I would encourage you to find something you're passionate about, even if you don't have a lot of money to invest in it right now. Start thinking about ways you can get behind that project. Start thinking about ways you could maybe be a little boring and leave a legacy yourself. Chris, as I land this plane, I wanted to give my contact information here. If somebody wants to get hold of me, they can do that at wellingscapital.com. We've got a lot of free resources you can get at wellingscapital.com/resources. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be here with you today. And Chris, thank you for the opportunity to talk about how to be a boring investor.
Yeah, wonderful presentation. I really love this idea because every day you were talking about like the flashy investor, and so it's really and Warren Buffett's one of the greatest investors of all time. And keep up the great work. And I think the audience really enjoyed that and got a lot of value. And we look forward to hearing from you some more.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it very much. Thanks, everybody.